Welcome back, everybody. Today we're trying something a little bit different for this deep dive. We're going to be looking at a photo essay and trying to approach it kind of like visual anthropologists.
Cool.
So the photo essay that we're looking at focuses on urban disparity in Islamabad, Pakistan.
Okay.
Specifically, we're looking at the F-7 sector and kind of two contrasting areas within that sector.
Interesting.
So the essay looks at this area called the French colony, and then also looks at the much more affluent areas
Okay.
that immediately surround it. So I think it's going to be really interesting to kind of compare and contrast and see,
Yeah.
what we can figure out about these two areas and
Right.
kind of the systems that create these two very different experiences.
I think it's a really fascinating way to get at these complex issues because, we're not just looking at like statistics and reports and things like that. We're actually using the images as our primary source of data. So it allows for a more kind of nuanced understanding of the lived experiences.
Right. And to add another layer to this, we're also going to be weaving in some anthropological concepts to help us unpack what we're seeing. So get ready for some vivid descriptions, surprising contrasts, and maybe even a few aha moments about how we perceive poverty and privilege.
I love it when we have aha moments.
Me too. Me too. So I think one of the things that's really cool about this photo essay is that the author also includes a lot of really rich sensory descriptions, like what it smells like, what it feels like. So it really kind of helps you imagine yourself in these spaces.
I think that that's key to anthropology. It's not just like an intellectual exercise. It's also about like trying to understand the sort of embodied experience of being there.
Absolutely. So the first image throws us right into the heart of the matter. It's an outside view of the French colony. And the contrast with the bordering F-7 neighborhood is really, really striking.
Okay.
So you see these rundown cars, dusty roads, exposed electricity infrastructure, and it's just a world away from the well-maintained streets that are literally just a stone's throw away.
Wow.
It's so interesting how the photographer uses these visual cues to highlight the disparity. So the composition deliberately juxtaposes these dilapidated structures of the French colony against these sleek modern buildings in the background. And it really makes you consider the socioeconomic forces that are at play.
Yeah.
They create these stark differences in such close proximity.
It's kind of shocking, right? Like how close these different realities can be.
It really is. And there's this one detail about the smell. So the essay describes the dominant scent as dusty air and pollution.
Oh, wow.
Even before we see anything else. That sensory detail, I feel like, paints a pretty vivid picture.
It does.
And it makes you wonder, right? Like, what about the environmental conditions these residents are facing on a daily basis?
Absolutely. And it speaks volumes about, the lack of basic infrastructure, things like inadequate waste management services. And it even makes you wonder about the possibility of industrial activity nearby.
Right.
And all these factors contribute to this lower quality of life.
For sure.
And really highlight the unequal distribution of resources and amenities.
Yeah, it's almost like before we even get to the people, we're already seeing the evidence of these systems of inequality.
Exactly.
So now we kind of move deeper into the colony, and the essay makes a really important point.
Okay.
It challenges that stereotypical view of poverty. It says these residents are not simply destitute.
Right.
They have livelihoods. They're resourceful. Yeah. They have a social fabric.
And I think this is where the anthropological lens is really, really helpful.
Yeah.
The essay encourages us to deconstruct poverty.
I like that.
Instead of just relying on like simplistic definitions, we need to consider the complexity of their economic activity, the social structures, and the agency of the individuals within these communities.
And the images themselves really drive this point home.
Yeah.
So we see a mechanic diligently fixing bikes.
Yeah.
A bustling market.
Yeah.
With shops, suggesting this economic activity and resourcefulness.
Yeah.
And it really challenges that image of a homogeneous slum that we often see in media portrayals.
Exactly. And the photographer is very deliberately highlighting the diversity of livelihoods and the dynamism of this microeconomy. And it's this visual reminder that people in marginalized communities are not just these passive recipients of aid.
Yeah.
They're active agents in their own lives.
I love that.
Creating opportunities and fostering social connections.
And there's even this photo of the author interacting with a barber.
Oh.
And they seem to be having this friendly exchange, and it just brings this human element to the story and reminds us that, these are real people with their own stories and relationships.
And that's, I think, what's so important about ethnographic observation.
Yes.
You actually go there and you experience it firsthand. And that's how you can start to understand the nuances.
Totally. And I think it makes you question all of those preconceived notions about poverty that we often carry.
For sure.
So let's talk about the economic activity within the colony, because the essay showcases a surprising variety of businesses.
Okay.
There's a grocery store, a tailor mobile accessory shops, a butcher, an electrician, an electronics shop, a vegetable vendor, a clothing market, even a pharmacy.
The sheer diversity of businesses is really striking.
Yeah.
It really does point to like this vibrant local economy and the existence of all these specialized skills and services.
Yeah.
So this is another way that it challenges that narrative of economic deprivation.
For sure.
And it really highlights the internal resilience of this marginalized community.
It makes you think about how we define poverty
Right.
and the limitations of our traditional economic indicators.
Yeah, it really prompts us to consider alternative metrics for understanding
Right.
well-being and economic activity in these marginalized communities.
And that maybe income levels aren't the only thing.
Exactly.
Or even the best measure.
Right.
Now, the next set of images focuses on housing and infrastructure. And again, we see a lot of variation.
Okay.
So some houses are brick, some are stone, some even have solar panels and satellite dishes.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and it's important to note this heterogeneity within the colony itself.
Right.
Because it challenges that notion of like a monolithic slum experience.
Yeah, it highlights that there are different levels of resourcefulness and adaptation
For sure.
within the community.
Right, but then we come to this recurring visual element, and that is the terraces built over the sewage canal.
Okay.
And it's such a powerful image
Yeah.
of resilience and adaptation.
Yeah.
Residents literally building their lives
Wow.
on top of a challenging environmental reality.
It's a fascinating example of how people adapt
Yeah.
to their surroundings, but it also makes you question the cost of these adaptations.
Right.
Like, are these terraces actually safe? Do they provide adequate living conditions?
Yeah.
So the image prompts us to consider the compromises
Right.
that people have to make in the face of limited choices.
And this leads us to one of the most visually striking and emotionally impactful elements of the entire photo essay.
Okay.
And that is the open sewage canal
Oh, wow.
running right alongside these homes.
Oh, my God.
And we even see children playing nearby.
Wow. So this image is particularly poignant because it visually captures this concept of quasi-terrorism.
Okay.
And that's a term that the author uses to describe this slow, insidious violence of neglect.
Wow.
The lack of proper sanitation infrastructure, it poses a serious public health risk and creates this unsafe environment for children. And it highlights these systemic inequalities that perpetuate these conditions.
It's just this stark reminder of the environmental injustices that often accompany poverty and marginalization.
And the fact that we see children playing near this hazardous site speaks volumes about the limited options that are available to these residents and the normalization of risk in their daily lives.
Yeah.
It really challenges us to consider the long-term consequences of this environmental neglect on the health and well-being of these communities.
And we can't forget about the smell, because the essay vividly describes the stench of the sewage.
Right. And this sensory detail, it's not just unpleasant.
Right.
It's this powerful reminder of how our senses shape our perceptions of places and people.
That's such a good point.
The smell of the sewage becomes this visceral symbol of neglect and marginalization.
Right.
And it influences how outsiders perceive the French colony.
Yeah.
And it potentially contributes to its further isolation.
It's almost like the smell itself becomes this barrier, a way to distance oneself from the community and justify the lack of investment in their well-being.
Exactly. And this is where the intersection of like sensory experience and social structures becomes really, really fascinating.
Right.
The smell of the sewage isn't just this physical phenomenon. It's loaded with social and political meaning. And it influences how we perceive and interact with this marginalized community.
So as we move on from the French colony, what stands out to you so far about the residents' lives?
I think I'm really struck by the resilience and resourcefulness of the community.
Yeah.
Despite the circumstances, they've created this vibrant microeconomy.
Yeah.
They have these social connections. They've adapted their living spaces to make the best of a difficult situation.
I agree completely.
Yeah.
I think it really challenges our preconceptions about poverty.
Yeah.
And reminds us of that strength and agency that exists even in the face of marginalization.
Absolutely.
Now, brace yourself for a stark contrast.
Okay.
Because we're about to transition to F-7 Marquez and its affluent neighborhoods.
Okay.
The essay describes this immediate shift in atmosphere. Well-maintained streets, bustling shops.
Okay.
And get this, an abundance of food smells.
Oh, wow.
It's described as having this sense of energy and affluence.
Interesting. So this shift is not accidental. It reflects the priorities of urban planning and resource allocation. The fact that we see such a stark difference between these two areas within the same sector raises all these questions about societal biases and how we value different communities.
And the visual language of the photos really highlights this disparity.
Yeah, like how?
So, for example, lush green spaces in F-7.
Right.
Compared to the dusty, uneven ground of the French colony.
Yeah.
High-end shops showcasing jewelry and bridal wear.
Huh.
In contrast to those small-scale essential businesses we saw earlier, it's this powerful visual commentary on the unequal distribution of resources and amenities.
Right. And it's not just about the presence or absence of these things. It's also about the quality. The green spaces are well maintained. The shops are, catering to a very different clientele.
And then there's this element of security, maybe even a sense of exclusivity.
Oh.
So the photos from F-7 show barbed wire spike security guards, which is such a stark contrast to the open and vulnerable nature of the French colony.
That's a really good point because it speaks to, I think, the anxieties and the priorities of the affluent residents.
Yeah.
While residents of the French colony are exposed to these environmental hazards and lack these basic amenities, those in F-7 are focused on protecting their property and maintaining a sense of separation.
Yeah.
So it really speaks to these power dynamics at play where one group has the resources to shape their environment based on their fears and desires, while the other is left to cope with the consequences of this systemic neglect.
It's like two different realities existing side by side, yet worlds apart.
Very much so.
And then there's this photo that really struck me.
Okay.
A Christian bride and her family.
Okay.
Leaving a salon in F-7 Marquez, presumably heading back to the French colony.
I see.
And this image is so powerful, I think, because it complicates the narrative. It challenges that simplistic notion of a strict divide between wealth and poverty.
Right.
Because here we see this visual representation of the interconnectedness of these seemingly separate worlds.
Right.
The bride adorned in her finery reminds us that these boundaries are fluid.
Yeah.
That people navigate between these different spaces and realities.
It makes you wonder about the challenges and opportunities that come with navigating those different worlds.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What's it like to be a minority group in this context? To move between spaces that represent such different levels of privilege and social standing.
Yeah, and it opens up this whole other layer of questions about the complexities of social mobility, the role of cultural practices and traditions, and the ways in which individuals negotiate their identities within a stratified society.
Now, moving on, the essay takes us to Swiss Park.
Okay.
Green space within F-7.
Okay.
And the descriptions emphasize this fresh air, lush greenery, a feeling of escape, which again is such a stark contrast to the polluted air of the colony.
Right.
It's almost as if nature itself becomes a symbol of privilege.
This highlights this concept of green beauty as a status symbol. Access to clean air and green spaces is not just an aesthetic preference. It's a privilege.
It is.
That is often unequally distributed.
For sure.
Those with resources can create and maintain these idyllic environments, while others are denied access to such basic necessities.
It's a reminder that environmental justice is a crucial aspect of social justice.
It is.
And speaking of privilege, there's this interesting observation about some children
Okay.
playing in Swiss Park,
Yeah.
who are potentially Afghan refugees.
Oh, wow. So this observation adds another layer of complexity.
Right.
It suggests that even among those who are displaced and marginalized, there are different levels of privilege and access to resources.
Right.
So it prompts us to consider the hierarchies
Yeah.
that exist even within vulnerable populations.
It makes you wonder about the circumstances of these children, how they ended up in this particular park,
Right.
what their lives are like compared to the residents of the French colony.
It's a reminder that marginalization is not this monolithic experience.
Right.
There are layers and nuances to it.
Absolutely.
And understanding those complexities is crucial for addressing systemic inequalities.
Before we wrap up, it's important to note that the essay attempts to move beyond that simplistic rich versus poor binary.
Okay.
And it introduces this concept of marginalized versus marginalizers.
That's a really important distinction because the residents of the French colony, despite having jobs and some resources, are still marginalized politically, legally, socially.
Yeah.
You know, they lack the influence and access to power that those in F-7 possess.
And the essay points out that many of the French colony residents are Christians.
Right.
A religious minority in Pakistan.
So this adds another dimension to their marginalization. You know, their religious identity potentially leads to further exclusion and discrimination, impacting their access to resources and opportunities.
So it's not just economics.
Right.
It's about understanding this intersection of various forms of marginalization.
Exactly.
Economic, social, religious.
It's about recognizing how these different systems of power come together to create and maintain these inequalities.
The essay contrasts the residents of the French colony with the affluent residents of F-7.
Okay.
Describing the latter as former bureaucrats, wealthy individuals, and those with strong connections to the authorities.
So this highlights the role of social networks and political influence in shaping access to resources and opportunities.
Absolutely.
It's not just about individual wealth, it's about who you know.
Right.
Your connections to those in power, your ability to navigate the system.
Right. And as a result, the authorities prioritize their needs.
Right.
Provide them with better services like clean streets, green parks, a sense of security.
It's a cycle that reinforces these existing inequalities.
Is.
It's a sobering reminder that urban disparity isn't just about visual differences. It's about these deep-rooted systems of power and privilege that shape the distribution of resources and opportunities.
The essay concludes with a thought-provoking argument about how the smell of the sewage canal is not just an aesthetic issue.
Right.
It's a socio-political one.
Yeah. The author suggests that the unpleasant smell actually contributes to the marginalization of the French colony. It creates a sense of aversion and reinforces negative perceptions of the community.
It's almost as if the smell itself becomes a justification for neglecting the area and its residents.
Exactly. It becomes a way to distance oneself from the community and to rationalize the lack of investment in their well-being. And what's even more interesting is how the essay connects this sensory experience to power dynamics. It points out that affluent residents have the power to influence the CDA, the Capital Development Authority, to create green spaces and plant trees in their neighborhoods because they find the fresh air pleasurable. So while the residents of F-7 are enjoying the benefits of fresh air and green spaces, the residents of the French colony are left to contend with the stench of neglect.
It's so powerful. How even those aesthetic preferences can be tied to power and privilege.
It is. You know, the affluent residents have the means to shape their environment in ways that are pleasing to them, while others are left to bear the brunt of environmental injustices.
It's a powerful example of how our senses can be politicized and used to justify inequality.
It really is.
And how do we even begin to unravel that?
Right. That's the question, isn't it?
It is. It is.
How do we challenge these deeply ingrained systems and perceptions?
And that's something that we'll continue to explore in the next part of this deep dive, so stay tuned.
Can't wait.
So it's fascinating how this photo essay, a seemingly simple collection of images, can spark such a deep and nuanced conversation about complex social issues. You know, as I was going back through the essay, I noticed the author uses some pretty dense theoretical frameworks to analyze the images they mention. Things like Foucaultian, Derridian, and Saussurean theories. To be honest, I had to look a few of those up.
I can imagine those names can sound a bit intimidating, but essentially, these frameworks help us understand how power, language, and meaning shape our understanding of the world, and in this case, our understanding of urban disparity.
Okay, so how do these theories actually connect to what we're seeing in these photos from Islamabad?
Well, let's take Foucault, for example. His ideas about power and discourse can help us analyze how the marginalization of the French colony is not just a physical reality, it's also a product of how knowledge and power are structured in society.
So it's not just that they lack resources, but the way we talk about them, the way poverty is defined and understood, actually reinforces those power dynamics.
Exactly. And Derrida's concept of deconstruction encourages us to question those binaries and hierarchies that we often take for granted, like the rich versus poor binary that the essay challenges so effectively.
And then there's Saussures' work on semiotics, the study of signs and symbols. I remember learning a bit about that in college. Could you remind us how that applies here?
Of course, semiotics helps us understand how images and even smells can carry different meanings and connotations depending on the social context. In this case, the smell of the sewage, for example, is not just an unpleasant physical sensation, it becomes a signifier loaded with social and political weight.
It's almost like a code, a way of communicating something beyond the surface level.
Precisely. And by understanding those codes, we can start to unpack the deeper meanings embedded in these visual representations of urban disparity.
This deep dive has definitely opened my eyes to the subtle ways that our perceptions are shaped by things we might not even be aware of. Those hidden layers of meaning and power that we often just accept as normal.
That's the power of anthropology. It helps us uncover these hidden structures and understand how they influence our lives and the lives of others. And in this case, it helps us see the complexities of urban disparity in a whole new light.
It's been an incredibly thought-provoking exploration. So as we wrap up this deep dive into urban disparity in Islamabad, what final thought would you leave our listener with?
I'd encourage your listener to consider how these concepts we've discussed, marginalization, the interplay of power and our senses, the unequal distribution of resources, how these things manifest in their own cities and communities.
That's a great point. I mean, we often talk about these issues in far-off places, but they exist everywhere, right?
Absolutely. So the next time you're walking through your own city, take a moment to really observe your surroundings. What do you see? What do you smell? And how do those sensory experiences connect to the social and economic structures that shape your environment?
I think that's a perfect note to end on. A call to action for all of us to be more aware, more critical, and more engaged in understanding and addressing these complex issues. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another fascinating exploration. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deeper. So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, exploring the complexities of urban disparity in Islamabad through the lens of this photo essay.
Yeah, it's amazing how much we can unpack just from these visual representations.
Right, and the way the author weaves in these anthropological concepts and those vivid sensory descriptions.
So it's like we were transported there.
Almost, I'm really struck by how this essay challenges us to think critically about our own perceptions of poverty and privilege.
And how those perceptions are often shaped by these deep-rooted systems of power and inequality.
It's not just about individual choices or circumstances, it's about understanding those larger sources at play.
And how those forces manifest in very real ways, like access to resources, infrastructure, even something as basic as clean air.
All right, so thinking about those systems, what can we actually do with these insights? How can we move beyond just acknowledging the problem?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah, it can feel really overwhelming.
It can, but I think the first step is awareness. Really paying attention to those disparities in our own communities.
That's a good point. We often talk about these issues in far-off places, but they exist everywhere.
Exactly. So the next time you're walking through your own city, take a moment to really observe your surroundings.
What do you smell? Are there stark contrasts between different neighborhoods?
Are there certain communities that seem to be neglected or marginalized?
And how do those observations connect to those larger systems of power and resource allocation?
It's about connecting those dots and understanding how our individual actions and choices can either perpetuate or challenge those systems.
Right, so it's about being more conscious consumers, more engaged citizens.
And advocating for policies that promote equity and justice.
It's a call to action for all of us to be more aware, more critical, and more engaged.
I think that's a perfect note to end on.
It is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into urban disparity in Islamabad.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll be back soon with another fascinating exploration. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deeper.